Okay, so today we're talking about religion, and I just wanted to start off by saying that religion has been a sort of it's an interesting field. It's always something that generates a lot of student interest. If ever you have a class on anthropology and religion, it fills up pretty quickly. So it's sort of a fascinating anthropological topic. And it was a huge interest of early anthropologists. I would say some of the first people who might have called themselves anthropologists or might have been interested in what other people were doing were interested in their beliefs, in their rituals, in their religious beliefs, and what kinds of things they thought about the world. And so there's these huge volumes of compilations of just kind of ideas about religion about around the world, even if they didn't actually think they were recording true religion. They were interested in this sort of idea of what they might have called primitive religion. And so, I mean, there's this big concern with, the relationship between religion and what was called magic. And so magic was always this thing that was kind of the evil twin of religion. And some people believe that religion evolved out of magic, or that magic was somehow a primitive issue and religion was the civilized expression of how things were done. And so there was this always this kind of strange relationship or idea that there were these two forms out there, one which was good and was called religion, and one which was sort of bad and was called magic. There was also a fascination, I think, as some of you were, I think, justly fascinated with the idea that instead of having sort of a formalized religious system, you might have a shamanistic system in which people were not officially priests, or would be kind of everyday people, but would have sort of special access to supernatural or divine powers, and that they would be able to exercise them. And this is kind of tied to the idea that religion permeates everyday life, the informal aspect of everyday life. And also, as some of you pointed out, it can be tied back to what we were talking about healthcare and the idea of who dispenses healthcare information and cures and those kinds of things. And so these were huge concerns of early anthropologists and kind of a baseline fascination of the discipline. And one of the key questions was simply, did other people have logic? Were their beliefs logical, or were they primarily superstitious because they didn't understand how the world worked, and therefore they were unable to comprehend, and so they would invent these kind of ideas of witchcraft or magic to explain a natural world which they simply did not understand. And there's a wonderful passage. It's from an anthropologist named Evans Pritchard. And I'll put the YouTube link. I've sometimes shown the first part of this in Intro to Anthropology. It's an older film. It's called Strange Beliefs. And I'd actually really recommend it for those of you who are interested in some of the first anthropologists who were going out and studying some of these religions. And in this film, it takes about 20 minutes for the first part, which I think is the most interesting part of it. But in it includes this example, which I've always loved, of the why did the granary collapse? And so Evans Pritchard was in an area of Africa where they built granaries which were elevated above the ground to keep them away, to keep the crops that were stored away from the termites. But the wood under the stilts, if you would get eaten away by the termites, and a granary would fall. And if you were taking shade under the granary, it might hurt certain people, or it might even kill you. Usually not kill you, but it might injure you. And so Evans Pritchard, would ask people, why the granary would collapse, and they would say, well, that's because of witchcraft. And he said, no, that's because the termites ate out, the stilts or the things that were holding it up. And they said, yes, of course we know that the termites eat, and that is why, that is the the proximate cause of why the granary fell, but why was this person under the granary when it fell? Why did it fall at exactly this time? Why do some people, why was that person there, and why did he or she get hurt as opposed to somebody else? And for that, they would say, well, the answer to that is some sort of mystical answer, witchcraft, or we might say, fate, or a religious belief. And in some ways, what Evans Pritchard said is that their system was completely logical. But they were trying to answer questions that, in fact, it's not that they didn't necessarily believe in cause and effect or didn't understand ideas about science, but what they were interested in are these questions that actually science finds impossible to answer, or is very unsatisfactory to us. So, I mean, if you think about right now, we're in the middle of a place where certain people get sick, and we have this virus circulating. Some people get it, some people don't. Some people have effects, some people don't. And you can say that statistically, there's if you get it and you're a certain age, you have such and such chance. But there's always going to be, there's going to be the idea, well, why did I get it? And why did I have these symptoms? And why did this happen to me and not to another person? And, I think for many of us, the simple sort of scientific answer seems inadequate in the sense that all science can give you is a series of probabilities and causes and effects, but it doesn't answer our questions as to why did this happen to me, or why did it happen to my loved one and not to someone else. And for that, people turn to other answers, such as religion, or as Evans Pritchard discovered in the society. They would say that these ultimate answers for illness, death, are in Zonde society, caused by witchcraft. So it's an interesting example because it shows that people can be both completely logical and completely believe in cause and effect, and yet have what we would consider to be strange beliefs in the idea of witchcraft. And that's sort of part of what anthropology has done, is to show the logic of other people's beliefs, or beliefs that were once considered to be primitive. But the other part of this is taking this into our own society. And there's an article called Baseball Magic. Again, it's something that I've assigned to some of you in Intro to Anthropology. Guest actually includes it in his reader. And it's basically, the idea is looking at George Gamelch was an anthropologist who also was a minor league baseball player for a while. And he, when he was taking his classes, was like, hey, wait a second, these things that, move this chat over, it might be in the way. These things that the baseball players are doing are actually very similar to the kinds of rituals that I'm reading about in the Trobriand Islands, or a faraway place. And so he wrote a whole article that talked about where baseball players use these kinds of rituals, how in some ways they are related to certain parts of the game that have low probability of success. So things like hitting and pitching are, you try to do it, but it's very difficult to get a hit. Whereas fielding, certain kinds of fielding, you would never use a ritual for, because at least if you're at the professional level, you have basically 100% chance of being able to field the ball. Whereas something like hitting and pitching seem much more susceptible to manipulation by chance, or it's unclear why certain things happen to you as they do. So this is the idea that, although we may think that we live in a modern society that doesn't include these kinds of things, that many of us, and I think probably some of you, can relate to this from your own experience on the athletic field, where you always will, never take have all kinds of rituals about what you might eat and wear in order to try and keep a winning streak alive or break a losing streak, that we actually have these kinds of beliefs as well. And like I said, this article is very famous. It came out or it was reprinted in, let's see, it was reprinted a lot in a in a reader that was called Conformity and Conflict, which always had this reader had, I think it's in its 17th edition, and it always featured these two pictures. One would be on top and would be an example of kind of a, what we might consider a traditional or an outside society. And here they are in, probably Papua New Guinea dressed in war paint. And then they would have a picture from, what we might consider a modern society. And here are some moderns that are also dressed in war paint. And then they would come out with another one. And, you can see a camel up there, a lonely rider. And then you can see a motorcycle. So there's supposed to be this parallel, right, between the making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And so here we have I think that perhaps is a rave, and again, a sort of traditional scene. Or here we have, a number of veiled people, and then we have people also being in a very conformist motorcycle group, you might say. So this is kind of a very common theme in anthropology, that you make something that is familiar to us and you put it into cross-cultural context, and all of a sudden it seems strange. So baseball magic, or making something that might seem strange and unfamiliar and bringing it into our own world and seeing the logic or the familiarity of it. And I think this has kind of been a twin or a common issue in anthropology, or common approach to how we do anthropology, even or especially with ideas about religion. And so you might, I guess I've sort of wondered, like, well, then what is this chapter doing here? Why, if this is such sort of a classical anthropological concern, why not put it back sort of earlier when we were studying, say, kinship or some of those classic anthropological ideas? And in some ways, I think it relates because we've paradoxically discovered how crucial religion has become in this era of globalization. So to step back a little bit, a lot of people thought that as people met other people from around the world, and as the world became more governed by one capitalist economy, the religious beliefs would basically kind of, if not fade out, they'd become less important. And so that societies would become more, what we consider more secularized, that there'd be a greater separation between politics and religion, and that people's ideas, kind of like we talked about with ethnicity, that globalization would result in a diminished sense of religion and a diminished sense of ethnicity, because people would be able to talk and communicate with each other. And so, these kinds of old habits and old identities would be able to fade out. Of course, this was dramatically proven to be false, especially with with the September 11th attacks in 2001. Everybody all of a sudden realized that religion was not going away at all under globalization, that religion and ethnicity and these things that we thought might fade out were not at all going away. And in fact, they might become more important in our globalized world, in part simply because people are talking to each other. And as Guest points out at the end of this chapter, they start to think about, well, maybe my religion should be global too. Why does one person have a global religion and mine isn't? And so, the kind of, in some ways, bringing people into contact with each other can sharpen differences as much as it diminishes them. And if anything, what we're seeing is how hugely important religion has been, and how it has become kind of a global issue for all of us. And so when we revisit some of the classic thoughts or ideas about religion, we realize that they were kind of doubly turned on their head. So we've seen Max Weber before. We talked about his work on the state, and the state having a legitimate, or well, we talked about it a couple times. One was with the idea of privilege and class and social class and prestige. We also talked about him in terms of the relationship of the state and how he talked about, well, the state has a legitimate, it's the only, it has a monopoly over the legitimate use of force within a territory. And so this idea is that in some ways there is a governing body which takes upon itself or appropriates the legitimate use of coercive force. Um, in some ways, and we'll talk about this at the very end, a lot of people never agreed to that. So a lot of religious ideas would consider their own ideas to be part of the legitimate use of coercive force, and would not necessarily think that that is something that should be surrendered to a state or a political organization, and that those two things should be separate in any way. Weber's most famous book is called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And in some ways, to very much simplify a very interesting and still important work, one of his ideas was that that capitalism in some ways depended upon this ethic of asceticism and sort of saving your money and continuing to work, and that the idea that time was money. And he kind of famously contrasted that with a more, you might consider, a more Catholic attitude, which had more festivals and celebrations and blowout days, and was not so given to the kind of what he would consider the Protestant ethic of always saving your money for even if you had a lot of it, you wouldn't necessarily spend it. And in some ways, Weber would then also say that this ethic becomes infused in society, and so then you don't need religion anymore because it becomes part of your secular ideas, or it becomes part of the capitalist system, and everyone sort of follows along with that. And so to go back to our idea about religion and globalization, in some ways, I think Weber's ideas about religion and capitalism have been doubly upended. On the one hand, we see that capitalism is thriving in many parts of the world which are not Protestant at all, and has been quite adaptable to Catholicism and Buddhism and Hinduism, and many different kinds of religious experiences can be completely capitalist and very much involved in their religious system. And also, of course, this idea that things were going to become more rationalized or secular as we went along, as we talked about with globalization, in some ways gone away. So I think this is why, and this chapter is in an interesting place, in that it shares a space with these other chapters that have to do with global issues or global problems. In this book, or in this chapter, Guest goes back into a number of people who've been kind of the most famous, thinkers, perhaps, on the idea of religion. And so he takes us back into Emile Durkheim, who's kind of claimed both by the sociologists and by the anthropologists, and Durkheim's work on, what was kind of the difference between the sacred and the profane, so the everyday, and then this sphere of the religious, which he took to be part of the sacred, and that what was most important was the collective aspect of this. And so this was a pretty groundbreaking in terms of how people started to look at religion as kind of the difference, or what happens in these spaces of what we might consider to be the sacred, and what we consider to be the profane. On the other hand, anthropologists sort of took a slightly, I think, different direction on this, in terms of how we looked at ideas about ritual. And so rituals can often take place in sacred spaces, but they also can be part of what we might consider our normal life, or our everyday life. And so one of the things that anthropologists have kind of pioneered is this idea that people all over the world go through things that we call rites of passage or transition points between various stages. So childhood and adulthood, or being single to being married, or various age transitions. And that there was a famous French anthropologist who wrote about over 100 years ago, um, a book that brought together these rites of passage from all over the world. And Van Gennep's idea was that in some ways, all of these rites of passage had three main phases. There was a phase of separation, in which the participant or participants were taken away from their normal life, and then would be put into a phase of transition, where they are neither their old identity and they haven't yet become their new identity. So as one of you analyze this in terms of a wedding, for example, the bride and the groom are separated from their usual state and put into special clothes, and then they go into this time of transition. They go through the ceremony, and then at the end they are reincorporated into society in their new roles. So you're supposed to then you may kiss each other and go out, and now you are married people, as before you were single people. And this can be applied to various rituals that go from, like I said, childhood or adolescence to adulthood. These occur in a lot of different places where we have this separation from normal society, a period of transition, and then when you are re-aggregated. And another anthropologist sort of took this perhaps even further. Victor Turner saw the transition phase as this kind of special phase of what he called liminality, a phase where you were betwixt and between. You were neither here nor there. And in this phase of liminality, some of the usual rules might get suspended. And so he also had this play between what he called structure and communitas, and that we find communitas in a lot of different ways. I mean, it's simply being, needing to be socially validated and to find each other. But we sometimes especially find it in this phase of liminality, in which the usual rules of life are somewhat suspended. So if we go back to our wedding ideas, one of you pointed out that funny time when they smash cake on each other, and there's this sort of very playful inversion, or during festivals where people dress as the opposite gender and everything gets kind of inverted. These would be times of communitas that would be opposed to this sort of structure of everyday life and the usual relationships. It's a time when people can reach out and find different ways of expressing themselves in community. One of the interesting things about the idea of a rite of passage is you can apply it to a very condensed activity like a wedding or a condensed ritual, but you can also apply it to kind of a longer phase of life. And I think it's sort of interesting to think about this in terms of college. College is itself often for many students, it's a time of separation from your usual community. And then you go through a rather long phase of transition or liminality when you were a college student. And in some ways, some of the usual rules of life don't apply quite as much anymore, are abbreviated, or at least when you're in a special setting, they don't. It's a time to kind of find a different kind of community than you might have had before. And then you have another ritual at the very end in which people are reincorporated as graduates, as people who are now supposed to be able to have learned something and are able to make a contribution to society. So you can see, I think it's a very useful framework to see your own life, and you can see small rituals such as commencement or such as convocation as a mini rite of passage, but we can also see a larger arc of the rite of passage in terms of how whole communities can become liminal and can emphasize ideas of communitas for a longer period of time. Victor Turner also, as one of you pointed out, has a lot of interesting things to say about the practice of pilgrimage, or of leaving your home community. In some religions, this is a requirement. In others, it's simply something that a lot of people seek to do. And so you can see this also as a kind of rite of passage in which people are separated from their home community. They go through this period of transition and liminality and communitas with the people they are traveling with. Sometimes there are some very famous stories about this, accounts of pilgrimage and how the group comes together, and then at the end you are reincorporated. You have achieved your goals, and you have done your pilgrimage, and you have a new and special state in society. And I was kind of thinking about this in terms of college, although it might seem a little bit ridiculous. I'm not sure if you remember how often we've been singing the college song lately these days, but it has that line about how you're climbing up the hill, seeking knowledge, seeking truth and understanding. So college itself, in its kind of cheesy way, can have these sort of pilgrimage aspects to it, where you leave your community seeking truth and understanding, and you will hopefully find that here, as well as a bit of communitas, at least in the good days. So these are some, I think there's some interesting tools to kind of analyze our lives, and even in the absence of, or you may not consider yourself to be a religious person, but you can see how these ideas have structured your life and have structured the lives of those around you. Guest also brings in our old friend Karl Marx. We, like Weber, we saw Marx back more famously associated with the economics section, and the idea of how people are divided into classes and what would eventually happen in capitalism. But Marx also has what may be the most famous quote about religion of all time, I think. I'm not sure if somebody finds a more famous quote, you can tell me about it, but this is a pretty famous quote. People often say this, right? Religion is the opium of the people, said Karl Marx. And as one of you noted, this is something that sometimes comes up in your classes, or some people will just use it as a way to kind of say, well, religion, that's just an opiate, which is sometimes it is quoted as religion is the opiate of the masses. So the idea is that it's something to dull the pain of the experience of living in this world, and it kind of keeps in classic Marxian style, religion is what keeps the revolution from happening, because people are so concerned about the afterlife that they don't, or are so soothed by the afterlife that they don't bother to address the problems in this one. And so this is a hugely famous quote. You have probably heard it before, or someone will tell it to you soon. It is rarely quoted in its full context. And so I'd actually urge you to kind of think about the full context of Marx's quote. It gets quoted sort of with a lot of words left out. And this is what Marx actually wrote in his notebook, which, if you read it carefully, is a slightly, maybe even quite different idea than how it is expressed in sort of popular ideas. So Marx wrote that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature. And then this is interesting: the heart of a heartless world and the soul of soulless conditions. Sometimes translated the spirit the spirit of conditions without a spirit. And obviously German is sometimes difficult to capture completely in English. It is the opium of the people. And so, Marx was certainly talking about religion here, and certainly concerned about how it sort of took people away from what he wanted to do, but he wasn't as down on it as some people in the sort of shorthand quote of it would have you believe. I mean, he's, the heart of a heartless world and the soul of soulless conditions. You can see here that religion can have a kind of a different effect than simply being an opiate. And I guess I would also add here that in Marx's day, there wasn't they didn't associate opiates with opiate addiction and being addicted to drugs. It was simply another kind of medicine that was used as a painkiller, but there wasn't the same association that we might have with it today. So I think that I mean, certainly this is a good quote to know and a good thing to know about Marx. But you should always, if somebody's going to just say, religion is the opium of the people, you should be able to come back and say, well, it's also the heart of a heartless world and the soul of soulless conditions if you read it in its full context. So always have to understand that. I want to actually now turn to something that was at the beginning of the chapter and we may have begun with in some ways, but I want to bring it out now, which is simply to ask, well, what is religion anyway? And in some ways, I think this is, I wanted to save it till now because I think we began, or anthropologists began, thinking that they knew what religion was, and you'd go out all over the world and try and look for it all over the world. But it's actually more difficult to define than you might imagine. So here's Guest's definition, right? A set of beliefs and rituals based on a unique vision of how the world ought to be lived, often, though not always, focused on a supernatural power and lived out in a community. So this is, a pretty big and overarching definition of religion. But I want to show you what happens if we just simply take a tiny bit of that out. This part about the supernatural power, especially since Guest tells us that it is not always focused on a supernatural power. So try this. A set of beliefs and rituals. Let me ask you this. What is this? Is this religion? A set of beliefs and rituals based on a unique vision of how the world ought to be lived in a community. What would you say that is? That's actually a question. It's an open question for you that you can answer in the chat or turn on your mic and say it. If we took out the supernatural part, what would that be? Law. Very close, Caitlin. Almost. A little less formal than law. It's actually the title of one of your chapters in this book. One of the first things we learned about. Society. I'll go with that. You could also say culture, right? A set of beliefs and rituals based on a unique vision of how the world ought to be lived in a community. I mean, what is the difference then between between religion and culture in general? And that's what sort of happens later on to anthropology, is that it becomes very difficult to sort of decide, well, where does religion begin and where does society begin? Or what is the difference between religion and culture? Especially as later on, people talked about religion as a cultural system and some of the ideas of religion as symbolic or as rooted in symbols. And I think that comes up if you look at the chart that it is on page 373 about the religion in a global perspective. And we see, as Danielle pointed out, we see Christianity and Islam forming up, well over half of people who are subscribed to religion. And we see another couple religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, which we know. We also see unaffiliated, which is kind of interesting. But then there's a whole category called folk religions, which is, if you combine that with other religions, is about 6 or 7% of the world. But what is a folk religion? And I guess I would also ask, well, what is the difference between a folk religion and other religions, which is kind of an interesting contrast too. So I point that out again. This has always been an issue, because if going back to the idea of, well, let's bring the supernatural back in here, right? If you bring in a supernatural power, then people are like, oh, aha, that's religion. But a lot of people in other parts of the world have different ideas about what is the supernatural. If there is such a thing as a supernatural, that itself is kind of an assumption that we make from our own society. So this has been kind of an issue in the study of religion. And that brings us to, I think, one of the most interesting thinkers on the idea of religion, who is Talal Assad, and wrote a section, or is in a section, about religion and power. And Assad was objecting to various points that had been made about religion. He was objecting to the idea that religion was only about the symbolics, and he was saying, well, what gives these symbols their power? You can't, just because you put up the symbol of a cross, like, why do people fight about that? Why are people interested in that? You have to look at the actual specific history. You can't just say, well, humans are symbolic, they like symbols. And yeah, I mean, I think that as Alex just put in the chat, colonization has a lot to do with this. A lot of how religion was defined, and who said, you had to worship certain symbols, and kind of you'd have to accede to the more powerful elements of society. And Assad is, as a person who actually, it's interesting that you bring up the idea of colonization. So had an interesting history himself. He was actually a student of Evans Pritchard. So he was sort of trained in a sort of classic anthropological sense. But he was very familiar with the world of Islam, and what he was saying is that a lot of the concepts that anthropologists had developed about religion were basically rooted in a Western and a Christian sense of what religion is, and a sense that the state and religion would be separate, and would inevitably become more and more separate. And one of his points was that in many societies, they never believed that religion and the state were two separate things, and they never thought that they would become more and more separate. And so, our ideas about, oh, they're mixing religion with politics would seem odd to people in other societies in which these are not necessarily seen as separate things at all. And I think that this applies to societies that are apart from our own, but we can also think about it in terms of our own society. If there's anything we've perhaps learned over the last 4 years or the last decade, it's that there is a whole segment of people in our own society who have no interest in necessarily separating church and state, and don't see that as something that should be valuable. In fact, their interest in becoming involved in the political system and in the state power is primarily a religious one. And so I'm not here to tell you it's good or bad. I'm just here to tell you that, the ideas about where religion belongs, and where, what kinds of power are going to be exercised are very much going to be live issues. And so it's probably beneficial for us to start thinking about them in terms of, in terms other than the ones we have traditionally thought of, which is that, oh, everyone is going to become more secular, or the state is automatically going to be separate from religion, or people will, people's religious ideas will kind of will be less important over time. Obviously, this is not the case, and we're probably going to have to rethink how we think about religion, and how we think about religious beliefs, how we think about how people's religious beliefs insert them or make them think about their political position in society. So really, like I said, super important passages and interesting work by Assad here. And if you're interested in that, there's some good readings and recommendations in that section. All right. Questions, comments, concerns?